What would you do if the one person standing between a ruthless corporation and the destruction of family's legacy was a young lawyer barely trusted to be in the courtroom? Could you keep your composure when a feared judge questions your very right to speak? And what if the law you needed to win wasn't just familiar? It was your own creation. Andrew Carter never imagined he'd be defending a small-town bakery from corporate giants, nor that his early work drafting legislation would become his greatest weapon. But as powerful enemies close in and threats escalate, can one determined attorney prove that courage, truth, and the written law are enough to fight back against those who think they're untouchable? Before we continue this story, let us know where you are watching from. If you like stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another special story for you. Andrew Carter could feel his heart pounding in his chest the moment he stepped into Judge Arnold's courtroom. The towering columns and austere wooden benches radiated a quiet intensity that made everyone hold their breath. Judge Arnold was notorious for his sharp tongue and absolute intolerance of anything he deemed frivolous. Most young lawyers avoided his courtroom altogether, but Andrew had little choice. He was there to defend Linda Rodriguez, a small business owner fighting to keep her family bakery from being shut down by a powerful corporation. As Andrew stood at the plaintiff's table, he caught a glimpse of the judge's stern face. Judge Arnold glowered down from the bench, clearly unimpressed by the sight of a lawyer who looked scarcely older than a law student. He tapped his gavel against the wood with a curt rap. "Mr. Carter," the judge began in his measured but biting tone, "what makes you think you have the authority to interpret this statute? Have you even read it in its entirety, or are you here to waste my time?" A ripple of discomfort passed through the spectators. Andrew swallowed hard. It was a harsh start, but he reminded himself that this was exactly why Linda had hired him. He knew this law backwards and forwards. More than that, he had penned it years before. As a law student interning for Senator Marshall, Andrew had drafted crucial updates to an outdated statute designed to protect small business owners from exploitative contract loopholes. He never imagined he would someday rely on those very words to fight in court. "Your Honor," Andrew said, straightening his posture, "I'm very familiar with this particular legislation. In fact, I wrote the initial draft of the statute during my internship for Senator Marshall." The judge's eyes narrowed, and the hush in the room grew even more pronounced. A murmur of disbelief spread among the spectators. Judge Arnold's expression changed from disdainful to momentarily stunned, as though he doubted he'd heard correctly. A young lawyer claiming to have written part of the law? It was almost unheard of. The judge leaned forward. "Care to repeat that?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of skepticism. Andrew cleared his throat and spoke calmly. "Yes, Your Honor. I drafted the core provisions regarding fair contract practices for small businesses. It was passed in a law with minimal changes." Silence. Then, from the defense's side, a mocking chuckle escaped Michael Talbot, the lead attorney for the corporation suing Linda. Talbot, older and exuding confidence, smirked at Andrew as if he were a child playing dress-up in a grown-up's courtroom. Judge Arnold, however, looked more intrigued than amused. "I see," he said. "Proceed, Mr. Carter. But understand this court will not tolerate theatrics." Andrew offered a polite nod and began laying out his argument. The corporation had twisted the statute's language to trap Linda in a contract that was never meant to apply to a family-run business. Instead, the law was supposed to shield owners like Linda, ensuring large corporations couldn't exploit them through obscure clauses or hidden fees. Linda sat beside Andrew, clutching a tissue, her eyes darting nervously between the judge and the defense table. She had inherited the bakery from her grandparents, and it was more than just a livelihood. It was her family's legacy. If this case was lost, all her grandparents' hard work would be erased. As Andrew presented each point, Judge Arnold's severe demeanor never wavered, yet he listened with keen attention. The defense attorneys exchanged conspiratorial looks, clearly planning their counterattack. When Andrew finished, Talbot rose with an air of smugness, leaning forward to address the judge. "Your Honor," Talbot began, "this young man claims to be the author of the law, but do we have any proof?" "At best, Mr. Carter was merely an intern who handed over notes. The notion that he has the expertise to interpret the law's intent is questionable. The laughter that spread across the defense side was muted but palpable. Andrew felt the sting of condescension, but he refused to show weakness. He took a measured breath. "I can provide the documentation," he said. "Email correspondence with Senator Marshall's staff, my original drafts, and the final legislative notes, all of which demonstrate my role." Judge Arnold raised an eyebrow. "Then I expect you to bring those materials to this court. Until then, I will withhold judgment on your claim." He rapped his gavel. "Court is adjourned until tomorrow." The crowd began to disperse, but Andrew didn't move from his spot right away. The rush of adrenaline still coursed through him. He glanced over at Linda, giving her a reassuring nod. Despite Judge Arnold's acerbic remarks, Andrew believed there was a sliver of hope here. If he could prove that he had authored the statute, he could also prove that the corporation's interpretation was disingenuous. He knew his next steps would be critical, gathering all the evidence, building the case, and preparing for the inevitable pushback from the corporation and its high-powered lawyers. Outside the courtroom, Andrew felt a jolt of confidence mixed with trepidation. Tomorrow, he would present the proof of his role in writing the law. The real battle was just beginning. Early the next morning, Andrew arrived at the law office where he had meticulously archived every piece of paperwork related to his legislative work. Stacks of boxes lined one corner of the dimly lit room. Over the years, he had never thrown away a single email printout or draft he had worked on during his internship with Senator Marshall. Most would have considered it overkill. But Andrew's instincts told him that thorough record-keeping would someday serve him well. He spent the next 2 hours sifting through documents, scanning correspondence, and piecing together a clear timeline. Finally, he found what he needed: email chains between him and the senator's chief of staff, annotated copies of his draft legislation, and a signed acknowledgement from Senator Marshall commending his role in crafting the bill. Andrew carefully placed the key documents into a folder. Just as he was about to leave for the courthouse, his phone buzzed. He glanced down, seeing an unknown number. Normally, he would ignore it, but something told him to pick up. "Hello," he said tentatively. A familiar voice came through, weary yet urgent. "Andrew, it's Senator Marshall. I heard about the hearing yesterday. Word gets around fast. Listen, I have reason to believe certain corporate interests are pushing back hard against your case. Be careful, they won't hesitate to play dirty." Andrew felt a coil of dread tighten in his stomach. "I suspected as much," he replied. "I'm prepared to handle whatever they throw at me." "Just stay vigilant," the senator cautioned. "Bring everything you have to court. I'll do what I can on my end." They exchanged a few more words before hanging up. Andrew pocketed his phone, uncertain if the senator's warning would be enough to shield him from the influence of powerful corporations. Still, he had no choice but to trust the system and his own diligence. When Andrew arrived at the courthouse, Linda stood outside, looking out of place among the bustling attorneys and reporters clamoring for news. She caught sight of Andrew and immediately rushed over. "Did you find what you need?" she asked, her worry evident in the tight lines around her eyes. Andrew held up the folder. "Yes, it's all here. It should be enough to prove I wrote that statute." Her shoulders sagged in relief. "Thank you. I'm scared, but knowing you're fighting for us makes it a bit easier." They made their way through the throng of people and into the courtroom. Judge Arnold was already seated, conferring with a clerk. At the defense table, Michael Talbot and his team exhibited a collective smirk, as though they had already won. Nearby sat Douglas Graham, the CEO of the corporation suing Linda. Graham exuded wealth and power, his posture stiff with self-assurance as he whispered something to Talbot. The gavel struck. "Court is now in session," Judge Arnold announced. His gaze fell on Andrew. "Mr. Carter, I trust you've brought the evidence regarding your involvement in drafting the law." "Yes, Your Honor," Andrew said. He stepped forward and handed the folder to the court clerk. Projected on the courtroom screen appeared images of email headers, legislative memos, and annotated drafts. Andrew explained each document in detail, ensuring Judge Arnold could see the official letterhead, matching timestamps and review notes from Senator Marshall's office. A hush settled in the room as it became apparent that Andrew had indeed been integrally involved in drafting the key portions of the statute. Talbot cleared his throat. "Your Honor, while these documents do suggest Mr. Carter participated, that doesn't automatically make him the foremost authority on interpretation. Laws are products of many minds." Judge Arnold leaned forward, studying Andrew's face. "Mr. Carter, do you have any clear evidence that you not only wrote but also influenced the legislative intent of the final version?" Andrew inhaled slowly. "Yes, Your Honor. The Senator's office asked me to research and propose language that would protect small businesses from unfair contractual practices. Every memo I sent emphasized closing loopholes that allowed large corporations to exploit local owners. It was a direct response to complaints from constituents like Linda Rodriguez, who were being subjected to rigid contract terms." Turning to a particular memo in the packet, Andrew highlighted a paragraph stating the exact purpose of the law. Judge Arnold read it silently, then passed the packet back to the clerk. His expression was difficult to decipher, yet there was a slight nod that suggested he acknowledged Andrew's credibility. Talbot, though momentarily thwarted, was not ready to concede. He launched a series of questions aimed at discrediting Andrew, suggesting that as an intern, Andrew might have exaggerated his contributions. Andrew responded calmly, pointing out each reference that proved otherwise. Throughout the exchange, Linda watched with hands clasped, silently praying the judge would see the truth. At the end of the session, Judge Arnold lifted his gaze. "Very well. Court will reconvene tomorrow for further deliberation. Mr. Carter, your evidence holds weight, and I expect the defense to address these points." We're far from finished. A tense relief enveloped Andrew. He had scored a small victory, but sensed that the corporation's counterstrike was inevitable. With the evidence on the record, the stakes had just been raised. It was clear the defense would do everything in its power to undermine him, and by extension, the law he'd helped to create. The next day, Andrew awoke with a knot of apprehension in his stomach. He found himself replaying the courtroom scenes in his mind, wondering if there was any angle he hadn't covered. His phone buzzed once more. The same unknown number. He considered letting it go to voicemail, but answered at the last second. "Mr. Carter," said a low voice he didn't recognize, "I suggest you drop this case. You have no idea what you're up against." Andrew's pulse quickened. Who is this? But the line went dead. With a shaky breath, he prepared to leave. He had a hearing in a few hours, and intimidation tactics wouldn't stop him. Outside, clouds gathered, mirroring his mood. He met Linda at the entrance to the courthouse. She looked worried, but determined. Without exchanging many words, they walked in together. Inside, they discovered a different atmosphere. Reporters had assembled, snapping photos and asking about the lawyer who wrote the law. Andrew gave them no comment, focusing on the security checkpoint and heading straight to the courtroom. Upon entering, they noticed a palpable tension. Michael Talbot was already at the defense table, whispering to Douglas Graham, whose jaw was set in an expression of cold resolve. Mr. Carter, Mr. Talbot, approached the bench. Judge Arnold ordered as soon as the session began. The two lawyers stepped forward. "I've received an anonymous tip alleging that certain documents introduced by Mr. Carter are forgeries." Andrew's heart lurched. He'd anticipated this move, but it still stung to hear the accusation spoken so bluntly. He lifted his chin, meeting the judge's gaze. "Your Honor, these claims are baseless. I can authenticate every file I provided." Talbot offered a theatrical sigh. "It's easy to manufacture digital records these days. We have what appears to be an email thread contradicting Mr. Carter's timeline. It suggests he may have taken credit for someone else's work." A hush swept the room. Andrew felt a bead of sweat form on his temple. "I'd like to see that email," he said, fighting to keep his voice steady. The court clerk displayed the so-called email on the screen. It appeared to show Andrew sending a message to an unknown recipient, stating he had minimal involvement in the statute's final version. Andrew's eyes scanned the text, noting small inconsistencies in writing style. Immediately, he recognized it was forged. "This is a fake," Andrew stated firmly. He pointed to specific anomalies. "Look at the date. It doesn't match the drafting period. Also, the IP address is suspicious. Your Honor, with your permission, I can demonstrate it's not from my official account." Judge Arnold scrutinized the email. Then he turned to Talbot. "How did you acquire this document?" Talbot feigned innocence. "It was delivered to our firm anonymously. We simply felt obliged to present it for the sake of transparency." Andrew explained to the judge how to verify email header data, offering to provide his original account records. With a nod, Judge Arnold permitted a short recess so Andrew could produce evidence to disprove the forgery. Court officials escorted him to a side room where he connected to a secured server that logged all messages during his internship period. Within minutes, he identified that the contested email never existed on the official server. When the proceedings resumed, Andrew laid out his findings. This email was never sent through the senator's server. The metadata is fabricated. There's no record in my archived emails or in the legislative system. This is clearly a forged document meant to discredit me. Judge Arnold's glare fixed on Talbot. "Mr. Talbot, this is highly irregular. Providing suspicious documents from an anonymous source is one thing, but if it's shown you knowingly submitted false evidence, you'll be in serious trouble." Talbot's face reddened as he cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we acted in good faith, believing the document was authentic." Linda clenched her fists at the plaintiff's table. Andrew could sense her anger and also her growing relief as the forged email was exposed. The judge permitted Andrew to continue his main arguments. He delivered a concise but thorough explanation of how the law was intended to operate, citing more examples of small businesses who had benefited from its protections. Linda's bakery case, he argued, was exactly the type of scenario the legislation was meant to address, preventing bullying tactics by large corporations. By the day's end, Judge Arnold adjourned court with a stern warning that he would allow the case to proceed, but expected no further attempts to distort evidence. Andrew felt a wave of temporary relief when he and Linda exited the courthouse. The barrage of cameras and reporters was still there, but now the story had taken a dramatic turn. The corporate side had introduced a forged email to undermine Andrew. Underneath the surface, Andrew knew this was a signal that the other side was both desperate and dangerous. He couldn't let his guard down. The phone calls, the false documents, someone very powerful wanted him to back away. But every scare tactic only solidified Andrew's resolve to protect Linda's family bakery and to prove that the law was never intended to crush the very people it was designed to help. Twilight settled across the city, painting the streets in a wash of neon signs and distant headlights. Andrew found himself driving to a secluded parking lot, his nerves on edge. He had received a cryptic tip from someone claiming to have more evidence about Douglas Graham's corporate dealings. Evidence that could confirm a pattern of intimidation and contract manipulation a guy. NST, small businesses. The instructions were clear. Meet alone, bring nothing but a willingness to listen. He pulled into the empty lot, the hum of his engine echoing in the quiet space. After waiting anxiously for several minutes, a hooded figure emerged from the shadows. Andrew's pulse spiked, but he opened his car door cautiously. "Hello," he called, stepping out. "You're Andrew Carter," the figure said, voice low, laced with tension. "I only have a few minutes." They handed Andrew a small USB drive. "This has internal memos, transaction histories, and emails. You'll see how Graham has systematically used legal loopholes to trap small business owners in ruinous contracts. If you're serious about exposing the truth, this is your smoking gun." Andrew stared at the drive. "Why help me?" The figure glanced around nervously. "I used to work for Graham. I saw firsthand how he operates. Couldn't stomach it anymore. But trust me, you're a marked man now. Don't let this fall into the wrong hands." Before Andrew could respond, the figure melted back into the darkness. He hurried into his car, locked the doors, and inserted the USB into his laptop. The files were staggering. Emails instructing legal teams to target vulnerable owners. internal notes bragging about how the newly amended statute could be circumvented. His breath caught. This was beyond Linda's bakery, an entire network of exploitation. That night, Andrew hardly slept. The next morning, he called Senator Marshall. "Senator, there's something you need to see," Andrew said. He drove straight to the senator's office, the USB in his pocket. Aides escorted him into a private conference room where the senator waited. As Andrew showed him the files, Marshall's expression hardened. "This is explosive," the senator whispered. "It's enough to trigger an official inquiry. But you have to be ready for a brutal backlash. Graham's influence runs deep." "I'm ready," Andrew replied, determination outpacing his fear. "Let's do it." They spent hours photocopying and encrypting the data, creating multiple backups to prevent sabotage. By mid-afternoon, the senator's staff began making discreet contacts in the legislature. The plan was to launch a formal investigation into Graham's corporation. Andrew left the office feeling cautiously optimistic. At the same time, he knew the more cornered Graham felt, the more dangerous his tactics might become. Sure enough, Andrew's phone lit up with another unknown number as he headed home. A harsh voice crackled through the speaker. "You're walking into quicksand, Carter. Turn over that drive, or you'll lose more than a court case." Andrew's heart thudded. Threatening me only confirms I'm on the right track. The caller let out a low chuckle. "Your funeral. Remember that." The line went dead. That night, Andrew took extra precautions, checking his apartment's locks and windows. He had reached a point of no return. If he backed down, countless small business owners would remain at the mercy of powerful bullies like Graham. And Linda's bakery would only be the first casualty. The following day in court, the tension was palpable. Andrew presented the newly obtained documents, those relevant to Linda's case, showing exactly how the corporation manipulated the statute's language to place undue burdens on her contract. Talbot's face drained of color as each piece of damning evidence was read into the record. Even Judge Arnold, who was normally stoic, appeared disturbed by the blatant misuse of the law. While the judge reviewed the documents, Andrew noticed Douglas Graham seated in the gallery, his expression stern and unyielding. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and Andrew felt a chill. Graham appeared unafraid, as if there were still cards left to play. Sure enough, once court recessed, Andrew's phone buzzed again. "I hear you're making quite a show of things." Douglas Graham's voice boomed. He sounded eerily calm. "But let me be perfectly clear. I have the resources to counter any evidence you drag into the light. You may be a minor inconvenience, but in the end, you'll regret trying to bring me down." "Funny," Andrew shot back. "I thought justice was something no one could outspend." Graham scoffed. "You're naive. I'd tread carefully if I were you." The call ended, leaving Andrew grappling with both triumph and trepidation. He had delivered a major blow in the courtroom, but Graham wouldn't fold easily. Moreover, Andrew suspected there were hidden alliances in high places that could shield the corporation from repercussions, even with the evidence piling up. Linda approached him in the hallway, her voice trembling. "All these people with power and money. It's terrifying. My bakery feels like such a small thing to them, but it's my whole life." Andrew placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Linda, this is no longer just about one bakery. It's about stopping corporate abuse of an entire law. The truth is on our side." Her eyes welled with tears of gratitude. Then she nodded, clinging to hope. Andrew knew the stakes had risen far beyond what he had imagined at the start. Yet every move Graham made to threaten or intimidate only solidified Andrew's resolve. With Senator Marshall initiating a broader inquiry, Andrew sensed the walls beginning to close in on Graham's corrupt operation. But he also knew that a cornered beast fights the hardest. The final showdown was coming, and Andrew would need every ally he could muster, and more than a little courage, to ensure that truth and justice won out. Word of the Senate inquiry spread quickly. Journalists unearthed more details about Graham's corporate empire, and public scrutiny intensified. On the day of Linda's final court hearing, the hallways were crammed with reporters eager for any new twist. Andrew arrived early, determined to remain composed despite the media frenzy. He and Linda found a corner of relative quiet where they could talk. "I'm so close to losing hope," Linda confessed, wringing her hands. "I can't shake the fear that Graham will pull one more trick." Andrew gave her a confident smile, hoping it hid his own apprehension. "He might try, but our evidence is overwhelming. We've proven that the law's intent was to protect, not harm. Business owners like you. We have documents, the senator's backing, and the truth. That counts for a lot." They made their way into the courtroom. Judge Arnold took his seat, face impassive, yet indicating the seriousness of the day's proceedings. Andrew noticed extra security presence, a testament, perhaps, to the growing intensity around the case. On the defense side, Michael Talbot fidgeted with his notes, while Graham looked unflappable, arms folded across his chest. "Counsel," Judge Arnold began, "we're here to hear final arguments in the matter of Rodriguez versus Graham Enterprises. I expect professionalism and clarity. No more theatrics." Talbot stood first, launching into a meticulously worded yet hollow address. He tried to paint Linda's case as an unfortunate misunderstanding, insisting that the corporation had merely exercised its contractual rights. He dismissed Andrew's evidence as misinterpretation and claimed the statute was ambiguous enough that Graham's approach was legally sound. When Talbot finished, Andrew rose. He started softly but built momentum with each point, reminding the court of the legislation's clear purpose. Then, he drew a direct line between Graham's manipulations and the statute's intended protections. He recounted Linda's plight, emphasizing how the contested contract clauses flew in the face of the law's foundational spirit. He highlighted the newly revealed documents, tying them to Graham's broader pattern of exploiting small businesses. Throughout Andrew's argument, Linda's eyes glistened. He felt the weight of every family that might be spared a similar ordeal if he won. When he concluded, the courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. Judge Arnold leaned forward, tapping his pen on the bench. "I've reviewed extensive documentation from both sides. Mr. Carter has presented credible evidence that this contract was utilized in a manner contrary to the very legislation designed to safeguard small proprietors. The plaintiff, Linda Rodriguez, has convincingly shown she's suffered significant harm as a result. Therefore, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff." He paused, glancing toward Linda. "Ms. Rodriguez, your bakery is yours to keep. Damages will be assessed, and the corporation will bear responsibility." A sudden roar of applause and camera shutters erupted. Linda clutched Andrew's hand, tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. Across the courtroom, Talbot looked shell-shocked. Graham stood, face ashen, and stalked out without a word to his legal team. As the reporters flocked to Linda, Andrew took a moment to breathe. He had done it. The law he wrote was upheld in its true spirit, and a vulnerable business owner was protected, just as he'd always intended. Outside, the scene was chaotic. Photographers snapped pictures. Microphones were thrust forward. Linda answered a few questions, expressing relief that justice had prevailed. Not long after, Senator Marshall held a brief press conference on the courthouse steps. "Mr. Carter has shown admirable perseverance," the senator announced to the swarm of media. "He exposed systemic abuses and defended the law the way it was meant to be used. An official Senate inquiry will continue to investigate these matters so that large corporations cannot twist legislation for their own gain." Andrew, standing nearby, felt a flood of relief. It wasn't just Linda's bakery anymore. It was a call to end rampant exploitation. For a moment, he spotted a grim-faced Graham being whisked into a black SUV. The fleeting eye contact spoke volumes. This wouldn't be an easy road for Graham. Investigations, lawsuits, and accountability loomed over him. A few weeks passed, and Andrew sat in his modest new office. The place was nothing fancy, just an old brick building he shared with a couple of other attorneys, but it was now bustling with calls from people who had heard about how he stood up to big corporate forces. He made time to visit Linda's bakery for a celebratory slice of pie, delighted to see it thriving with more customers than ever. He was also receiving updates from Senator Marshall. Every piece of evidence Andrew had supplied was helping uncover deep-seated corruption. There would be more hearings, more legal battles. Yet Andrew felt a sense of pride and purpose he had never experienced before. He gazed at the framed copy of the law on his wall, his original legislative draft. A faint smile crossed his face. Judge Arnold's stern glare, the intimidation tactics, the near misses with danger, all of it was worth it if the law fulfilled its true purpose. He promised himself he would keep fighting. He would be the kind of lawyer who championed those without a voice, defending them against powerful adversaries willing to bend the law for their own ends. As day turned to dusk, Andrew finally leaned back in his chair. His phone buzzed. Elaine Turner, his old mentor from law school, wanted to congratulate him and talk about potential collaborations. Life was moving forward, new doors opening. Still, he would never forget that one fateful day when Judge Arnold nearly laughed him out of court, only to discover that the unassuming young lawyer had written the very law in question. In proving himself, Andrew had reminded everyone that courage, integrity, and a commitment to justice could topple even the mightiest corporate giants. Linda Rodriguez's victory in court was more than just a personal triumph. It was a clear demonstration of how laws, when crafted and used properly, can genuinely protect the vulnerable. Andrew Carter's journey from being a nervous young advocate to standing firm against intimidation signaled a profound statement. No one is too small or too young to challenge immense power if the truth stands behind them. In the aftermath, Douglas Graham faced ongoing legal scrutiny as Senator Marshall's inquiry dug deeper into his corporation's dealings. The forged documents, intimidation attempts, and backroom tactics only solidified the public's demand for accountability. Many small business owners came forward with their stories, catalyzing a broader movement to ensure legal protections couldn't be twisted for corporate gain. Judge Arnold, initially dismissive of Andrew, gained a renewed respect for the young lawyer's determination and moral compass. While the judge's intense style never softened, there was an undeniable shift in the courtroom dynamics whenever Andrew stood to speak. Talbot, meanwhile, was forced to reckon with the fallout of relying on dirty strategies to mask a losing argument. For Andrew, life moved forward with a sense of purpose. The law he helped draft had not only saved one family bakery, but served as a beacon of fairness. He continued to fight for clients unable to navigate complex legal obstacles on their own. The story of how the judge was shocked to learn Andrew wrote the law became part of courtroom lore, reminding everyone that true justice can prevail against corruption. And at the center of it all stood Andrew Carter, committed to fighting for the overlooked, the outmatched, and the underdog, proving that integrity and courage can outshine even the darkest shadows.